The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, we just heard shocking testimony at the Human Resources Committee from the CEO of the Central Okanagan Food Bank. He says projections are another 100% increase in food bank demand in the next 3 to 4 months due to inflation. He expressed how donors and volunteers are now clients. Liberal inflationary spending and carbon tax are adding to the cost of food. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government is just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister take the tax off of farmers, families, and First Nations? Finally.
Here. The Honourable Minister of Families.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to invest in strengthening social security programs like Old Age Security, Canada Pension Plan, and support for families like the Canada Child Benefit and $10 a day national childcare. Programs which the Conservatives continue to vote against, totally lacking empathy and understanding for the struggle that Canadian families are facing. On this side of the House, we'll continue to do the hard work to ensure that we're there to support Canadian families.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that answer won't satisfy all the Canadians lining up in a food bank for the first time in their lives, or the food banks that are losing donors and volunteers due to Liberal inflation. We heard from not-for-profits how they see the rising price of gas as a barrier to volunteering, and how senior volunteers are being forced back to work to afford basic necessities due to inflation. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government is just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister take the carbon tax off of farmers, families, and First Nations? Finally.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important that we focus on affordability for families, and it's also important that we look at facts when it comes to the carbon price that we've put in place. It's also important to remind Conservative members that they ran on a carbon price, and carbon pricing is the most efficient and the cheapest way to lower our emissions, Mr. Speaker. But with respect to food prices, particularly those facing lower income families, Mr. Speaker, today an article lists here that 94% of households with incomes below $50,000 receive far more rebates exceeding their carbon tax costs in 2023. Mr. Speaker, lower income folks are enjoying more rebates than carbon costs because our carbon pricing.
The honourable member for Haldeman Norfolk.
After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government has made life unaffordable for Canadians in every province and territory. Canadians are suffering under this Prime Minister's oppressive carbon tax. And while he taxes, he also divides, pausing the carbon tax on home heating oil in Atlantic Canada because he wanted votes, while he quadruples the tax on every other Canadian. When will this Prime Minister finally cancel the carbon tax on families, farmers, and First Nations?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'll focus my response on an economist's response to the rhetoric in this House with respect to the carbon price. He said if we got rid of the carbon tax and the rebate, then this would harm a much larger fraction of lower and middle income households than it would higher income households, Mr. Speaker. Very clearly, the economist from Calgary indicates that our carbon price sends more money back to 94% of families who earn less than $50,000, Mr. Speaker. It's an affordability measure and it fights climate change.
The honourable member for Haldeman Norfolk.
At a time when this country is working towards reconciliation, the Liberals have saddled First Nations community with a punishing carbon tax. First Nations are so burdened by this unfair tax that they have decided to take the government to court. Canadians everywhere know that this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. So, when will this Prime Minister finally remove the carbon tax from farmers, First Nations, and families?
Yeah, when?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'll note that our carbon pricing mechanism sends more money back to lower income families than it does. That includes both the fiscal amount and the economic impact. And something the Conservatives love not to focus on is the impact of climate change, Mr. Speaker. Climate change impacts the price of food more than any other factor, Mr. Speaker. And we're also helping farmers because farmers are the ones that know climate change is real because it impacts them first, and that's what's driving up the cost of food, Mr. Speaker.